This is going to be a response video to a conscious community brother by the name of Garfield. He offers some ideas regarding church history and theology, which I want to respond to. But before I get to that, I just want to remind those of you that haven't subscribed yet to go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. For those of you who don't follow the world of urban apologetics, there was a recent debate between Jabari Osazu and Dr. Vince Bantu on the topic, is Christianity the white man's religion? And since that debate, which I believe was in October of this year, 2019, there's been a lot of chatter from the conscious community in trying to save face, since, according to the scorecard, Dr. Bantu won the debate. Someone posted a video in one of the groups I'm a member of, and I watched some of it. And I wanted to address some of the points the fella in the video made. I'm not going to get through every point in the video since it's over 2 hours long, and there's a lot of mistakes and fallacious reasoning throughout. But I'll touch on a couple of the key points I saw. So with that being said, here's a clip from that video.
Family, y'all don't think I was gonna beat up these pastors? You really think Garfield don't have the information to beat up these? It's not even a matter about beating them up, but to teach the people in the church who probably never heard that from them, because you guys have become agents of Paulinian Christianity, which is the one that the Roman church adopted. Why didn't the church adopt the Jewish Christianity? Why did they adopt that? You know why? Because it said that you had to be circumcised and follow the laws. The Christians nowadays, they all talk. I love Cherry Love. I love Pastor Bennett. But every time you talk to them and you bring the Old Testament, oh, you got to bring up the Old Testament, because you are following the version of Christianity that doesn't like the Old Testament. Paulinian Christianity don't deal with the Old Testament. Remember when Marcion went to Rome, he said, get rid of the Old Testament because that's the evil God. Remember that. That's the evil God.
Now, one of the things that you'll hear throughout these clips is this guy referring to Christianity as if it's different types of Christianity, when in reality, there's only one Christianity. And I'll address that a little bit in depth a little bit later on. But for now, I just want to point out the fact that throughout, he's conflating Paul's theology with Marcion. He implies that they're synonymous. And then he takes it further in this part by saying that modern Christianity is also Marcionian theology. And what he's doing is he's twisting himself up. How is that even possible when Marcion and his doctrine was rejected by the church and he was excommunicated and labeled a heretic? So that's just pseudo history right there that the fella's doing. So second of all, no one is rejecting the Old Testament. This is basically a rhetoric coming from someone who doesn't know the scriptures. And it reminds me of what's written in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. It says, bear in mind that our Lord's patience means salvation, just as our dear brother Paul also wrote you in the wisdom that God gave him. He writes the same way in all of his letters, speaking in them of things of these matters. His letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort, as they do the other scriptures to their own destruction. And that's a prophecy that's literally being fulfilled in this video. And it's a demonstration of the ignorance of the scriptures to try to divorce Paul's theology from the Old Testament. 1 Corinthians teaches that God's wisdom is revealed by his spirit. In chapter 2, it says, we do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. No, we declare God's wisdom, a mystery that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So in light of these passages, I'm not surprised that Garfield has no idea what he's talking about. Paul dealt with Adam more than any other New Testament writer. He talks about Adam as a type of Christ in Romans, and in 1 Corinthians, he talks about how Adam brought sin into the world, and that those who are in sin, or those who haven't been converted and regenerated, are still in Adam. Paul also had a passion for the Gentiles. He called himself the apostle to the Gentiles and God's inclusion of the Gentiles in his plan of salvation. And although that wasn't fully revealed in the Old Testament, it's there. If you go and you look at Amos 9:11 through 12, if you look at Joel 2:28 and 29, Isaiah 56, 6 and 8, Paul says it was a mystery in Ephesians 3 and 6. And it was also revealed to Peter as explained in the book of Acts. After they finished speaking, James replied, "Brothers, listen to me. Simon has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name. And with this, the words of the prophets agree." And that's Acts 15, verse 13 through 15.
But ladies and gentlemen, why is it Irenaeus, who's working with the Roman government, why is he the one orchestrating your four gospels? So you would not have the four gospels if it wasn't for Irenaeus and Tatian. So isn't this the formation of your church? The system of your church? Family, you gotta know Christian history. I wish Jabari would have let us debate these guys. I was gonna go there and teach.
I think this clip might actually be my favorite. It's absolutely hilarious. First, he said that Irenaeus was working with the Roman government, which I think is an outrageous statement because Rome was still persecuting Christians in the 2nd century. Then he says that Irenaeus was orchestrating the four Gospels. Number one, the Gospels were mentioned by Papias in the early 2nd century, probably about 50 years before Irenaeus. The Second Epistle of Clement has quotations from Matthew. Justin Martyr also quotes from the Gospels in the mid-2nd century. And we have manuscripts of the Gospels dated prior to Irenaeus. So not sure exactly what Irenaeus was orchestrating. Second, if he means that Irenaeus added the names to the Gospels again, we can go back to Papias, who mentioned a gospel according to Matthew and Mark. So his comment seems to be misguided in that regard. Further, his suggestion that if it were not for Irenaeus, we wouldn't have the gospel narratives or the names or whatever he meant by that would seem to be a non sequitur. As I stated above, the gospels already existed. And if you understand the sovereignty of God, whatever work God used Irenaeus to accomplish could have been accomplished by someone else raised up by God. I remember years ago I planned to go and preach at 125th Street subway station. And as I stood on the platform of the station and hesitated and gathered my thoughts, a man walked right past me and started preaching. He literally came right from behind me and passed by and started preaching on the platform. And I realized at that moment that God will raise up people to do his work. If I don't do it, he'll use someone else. So then Garfield asks a question. Isn't this the formation of your church? Which I can easily answer, no. Christ said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Ephesians 2:19 and 22. Now, therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. So contrary to what Garfield may have been taught, the church age started after the resurrection of Christ and the coming of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, which was over 100 years prior to Irenaeus coming on the scene.
There's no Bible, right? So what did the early Christians follow? Did they believe that Jesus was God in heaven? Remember, you had the Jewish Christianity, right? These are Jews who only believe in the Old Testament. That's it. They only believe in the Old Testament. What? Look at this now. Look at this now, family. They only believe in the Old Testament, but guess what? You have the guy named Paul who writes. So you have another version of Christianity, the Paulinian Christianity. That's not the Christianity from somebody who's an eyewitness to Jesus. Why are we even listening to Paul? He never knew Jesus, according to the storyline in the Bible. So why would his version be better than the Jewish followers of Jesus who followed Jesus?
So he says, why are we listening to Paul? He never knew Jesus. This is what's called a genetic fallacy. Whether or not Paul personally knew the historical Jesus has no bearing on his call or appointment by the Lord, nor on the truthfulness of his words. Second, Garfield says, why would Paul's version be better? Why would Paul's version be better than what? There is only one way. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father but by me. There's no alternative way, just the one. The religion was called the way from the first century, and the believers were followers of the way. Acts 9 and 2. And asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Acts 19 and 9. But when some became stubborn and continued in unbelief, speaking evil of the way before the congregation, he withdrew from them and took the disciples with him, reasoning daily in the hall of Tyrannus. Acts 19 and 23. About that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. Acts 24 and 22. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. 2 Peter 1 and 2. But there were also false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction on themselves. Many will follow their depraved conduct and will bring the way of truth into disrepute. I think that this passage from Second Peter is timely when dealing with folks who teach against the way or who try to invent different versions or different paths to God. There is no ambiguity on this subject. There is only one way, and that is the Messiah, Yahshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ. And those who follow him are called followers of the way, or Christians, who are also followers of Christ, aka the way.
Look, family, at the Christianity and how it developed. Paulinian writings is the version that they go by today. And that's the one the Roman church adopted. This is why, listen, the people that got persecuted, you know why they got persecuted, what the Christians don't tell you? Not the Gentile Christians from Paulinian Christianity. I bet you. Let's do a statistic. Listen to this right now, because this is important in all its history right now. The people who follow the Gentile Christianity, they would be willing to celebrate Roman holidays. Gentiles will celebrate Halloween. They'll celebrate birthdays. They celebrate Thanksgiving. They'll celebrate Columbus Day. They celebrate that. But the Jews who go by the law, if you notice it in today's society, they don't celebrate none of that. They live by the law. So those are the people that the Roman people persecuted because they did not want to celebrate or worship other gods that existed in the time period of Rome. So those people got persecuted and some of them got killed. Those are the real Christians we need to focus on and what they believe, because they didn't believe like the Paulinian Christians.
So here we see Garfield totally go off the rails and say that the real people who were being persecuted by the Romans were the Jews and not the Gentile Christians, and that they got persecuted for following the law, while the Gentiles got a break because they celebrated Roman holidays. To argue that Gentile Christians weren't persecuted by the Romans is pseudo scholarship. Now, I'm not going to argue that the Jews weren't persecuted by the Romans, but I will say that at different parts of the Roman Empire, Judaism was tolerated, and this was the case particularly at the start of Christianity. Julius Caesar had allowed Jews to follow their religious beliefs, and Augustus signed off on that as well. And so it happened that during the Decian edict of 215 AD, the Jews were exempted. But the Christians were persecuted and killed for not worshiping Roman gods. Nero, after 64 AD, persecuted Christians. This is according to the Roman historian Tacitus. To get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, for whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. In a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Pliny the Younger testifies of Christian persecution in a letter. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatened them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. And this is the reply, Trajan to Pliny. You observed proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who had been denounced to you as Christians, for it is not possible to lay down any general rule to serve as a kind of fixed standard. They are not to be sought out. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished, with this reservation, that whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it, that is by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. Anonymously posted accusations ought to have no place in any persecution, for this is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age. So I'm really surprised that Garfield made his argument because it's not rooted in the historical record or mainstream scholarship.
Christianity, Paul created an environment where Gentiles would be accepted into the kingdom. So you don't have to be circumcised anymore to be a Jew. That is the person's Christianity who we're following. It includes everybody. Everybody.
Here he goes again, trying to separate Paul's theology and work from the other apostles in the Christian movement. This is a type of argumentation I often hear from Hebrew Israelites. But more important to the point is that Paul didn't create this environment. It didn't originate with Paul. In fact, if you read John 3:16, it says that for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. Here's what Peter says in the book of Acts. Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice and addressed the crowd. Fellow Jews, and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk, as you suppose. It's only 9 in the morning. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Acts 14 and 27. On arriving there, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. Revelations chapter 7, starting at verse 9. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And they were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So in order to make the argument that Paul created this idea, you would have to ignore all of the evidence to the contrary, which is obviously what Garfield has done. I'm going to stop here. Like I said in my intro, there are mistakes and logical fallacies throughout the video. And don't think that I have anything against Garfield. No, I have no issues with him personally, just with what he's teaching and what he's putting forth as scholarship. It doesn't pass the test. The ultimate dagger is the truth. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to hear more content like this.